So a few months ago, or however long ago it was, I did a video talking about pump speed and its correlation to temperatures and why you shouldn't run your pump at 100%. And that video kind of backfired in the way that it didn't go exactly as I had hoped, because I did it with an AIO. And an AIO is a totally different scenario from where I typically kind of employ that sort of train of thought. So with my new rig that's behind me, which is still completely nameless, normally I name my rigs, but I didn't on that one, maybe because I didn't have time. Anyway, I digress, not important. I was able to rerun that test again, this time with an open loop and dual rads and a GPU in the loop and a CPU in the loop and a big reservoir and a fully manual pump. That means I'm not relying just on putting in some percentages in a PWM header on a motherboard. I can actually do a real A, B, C, D, E comparison. I did 5 different speeds to see whether or not you should be running your pump at 100% or running your pump at its lowest speed or somewhere in the middle. Enhance your professional monitor setup with the Viewsonic VP27885 5K, featuring 100% sRGB, 99% DCI P3 colors, and HDR 400 for deep contrast that align perfectly with Mac's industry-leading color performance. The VP27885 5K supports laptops, PCs, Macs, and more with Thunderbolt 4, USB-C, HDMI DisplayPort, and USB inputs. If you're looking to increase your screen real estate for projects, click the link in the description for more. So let's talk about some of the testing methodology real quick. So my system behind me, if you haven't seen, it's a 9950X3D. CPU is not important. I didn't do CPU testing for temperatures on this because two 360 millimeter radiators by 30 mils thick is way more cooling than a 9950X3D with PBO turned on needs to. It would never change no matter what the pump speed was. The CPU would always run nice and cool. However, it does have an Astro 5090 GPU in there, which has the Thermal Grizzly Delta Mate water block that can dump nearly 600 watts of heat into the loop. Actually, it's 600 watts of power draw. The actual wattage of heat dump into the loop is potentially even more than that. So the pump in this loop is a D5, and it is a manual D5. What that means is on the back of the pump, I've got a dial with 5 different speed settings, which is a knob. So technically, it's nearly infinite speed settings from 1 to 5. So I can set that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or anywhere in between those numbers. I chose to do 5 tests starting at 5 and then 4, 3, 2, 1 to see what the actual pump speeds do in relation to temperature. Now the theory for a lot of people is that you should be running your pump as fast as possible so that you can move the fluid over the hot part, or in this instance is going to be the 5090, as frequently as possible. Now, the downside to that is the faster you move the fluid, sure, you're moving it over the part really fast, but you're also moving it through the radiators really fast too, which means they spend less time sitting in the rad cooling down. That's the theory anyway. So that's one of the reasons why this video is going to be a lot of fun, because of the fact that it allows us to really see whether or not theory holds up. Now, here's one of the things I want to talk about are the different pump speeds real quick and the actual flow. So I'm not measuring on this percentages. So I'm not saying pumps 5 is, or speed 5 is 100% and speed 4 is 80%. It doesn't work that way because speed 1 isn't 0%. So it's got a little bit of a weird curve for it. Let me explain what I mean. Pump speed 5 on this D5 pump in this setup equates to about 2.8 liters per minute. Now you can take that number and times it by 60, and that's how many liters per hour. You can just use whatever math figure you want to turn it into how many liters per day if you want. So in this instance, I am just measuring liters per minute. Now pump speed 4, if we're talking about it being a 20% difference in speed potentially between each setting, because there's 5 numbers, pump speed 4 is actually 2.2 liters per minute. So as you can see, we dropped down from 2.8 to 2.2, or just over a ½ liter per minute difference in speed. Pump 3 is 1.8 liters per minute. So you can see from pump speed 5 at 2.8, dropping down to 2.2 for pump speed 4 is a difference of 0.6, but pump speed 4 to pump speed 3 is only a difference of 0.4, so not 0.6. If we go from pump speed 3 to pump speed 2, it's kind of interesting because we're back to that 0.6 differential. So we went from 1.8 to 1.2. And then if we go down from pump speed 2 to pump speed 1, we drop from 1.2 liters per minute down to 0.8 liters per minute, or back to the 0.4. Now there's variance in that. So it's not perfect. It's not gonna, just because I have the dial perfectly set between 4 and 3, because of the amount of resistance that's in the loop does not mean it's gonna automatically turn into a very consistent drop in speed. So that's why I'm telling you guys what the liters per minute volume is per speed when we do this particular test. Now you could take this exact same pump and put it in a different loop and potentially get over 3 liters per minute or 3.5 liters per minute, because it really depends on how your loop is set up on the type of resistance that you're going to get in your loop. My loop behind me has two 360 millimeter radiators, a full cover water block for the Delta Mate on the 5090, as well as the Optimus block for the AM5 CPU that I have in there, so the AM5 chipset. And we obviously have the reservoir in the back, which has got a pretty decent amount of volume to it, but it is not a big cylindrical reservoir. It is a smaller, more distro plate style reservoir. And we have a lot of 90-degree fittings. Every single 90-degree fitting adds a significant amount of resistance in the loop versus something having like a long bend in a tube or something like that. Now, fortunately, the fittings that are used in this loop do have very smooth transitions into that turn, but every time the fluid has to make a 90-degree turn, it is a bit of resistance. In fact, blowing air through this loop with your lungs is actually quite difficult. So you really would have to like push a lot of air out of your lungs to try and get any air through the loop. It's mostly because of the resistance of the microfins that you have to go through on both of the blocks. Radiators themselves are not too restrictive these days, depending on the thickness of the rad. A thicker rad would actually have less resistance because those rows are longer, which means more volume inside the radiator. More volume means more flow. So in this instance here, with having 30 mil rads, they're a bit more restrictive than if they were 45 or 60 mil, or even like a monster rad from AlphaCool, which is an 80 mil thick radiator. So anyway, my particular setup is somewhat restrictive and difficult on the pump. That's one of the reasons why we're not seeing pump speed 5 necessarily be all that much than pump speed 4. Anyway, moving on, the testing methodology. The fans are set to 70% fixed RPM. So we don't need a ramp or a curve or another variable thrown into this test, because if we did, then we wouldn't know if our temperature differences were simply because of the fan curve or because of the pump speed. So pump speeds are set to their 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 with those liters per minute that I already mentioned. And the fans are set at 70% fixed, all of them. Even the fans that are not on a radiator, they're at 70%. Little notable change, I mentioned in previous videos that I was going to switch the rear 120 out for a rear 140. So that is a 140 intake in the back now, not a 120. So I got a little more volume of air, plus two 120s were added behind the reservoir to bring a little bit more positive pressure into the chassis. Even though they have the reservoir in front of it, the air still makes its way around. I showed that with smoke in a previous video. Okay, moving on. It is running Steel Nomad for 30 minutes. Last time I did a temperature test with this, when I was doing the fan configuration video by either having a top exhaust or a top intake and et cetera, 20 minutes wasn't long enough to reach equilibrium, so I did 30 minutes in this instance, which was long enough. Let's see, with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the temperatures here. So you can see by looking at the chart, the light blue is speed 1, the pink is speed 2, the yellow is speed 3, purple speed 4, and the green is speed 5. You can kind of see that everything is hovering right around that between 52 to 55 C mark. Now, obviously they're so close together, it's actually very difficult to tell the difference. So this is where you might look at this and go, well, it really doesn't matter. Which is kind of a fair conclusion, but you gotta dig in a little bit deeper. So if we go ahead and zoom in on the chart, you can see it's really an interesting story. It looks like speed 2 and speed 3 were actually giving us overall the best speeds at remaining under 55C for most of the test, but reaching 55C by the end. You can tell by looking at the green line, the purple line, and the light blue line, which is speed 5, speed 2, and speed 1, all of them jump up to nearly 58C when it comes to the average temperature of the GPU die. Now I want to say right now that this chart, to smooth it out a little bit, because there's lots of variation in the Steel Nomad test, this is a smooth chart where each data point is actually an average over the previous 10 seconds to give us our rolling 10-second average. So that smooths it out a little bit more, otherwise there would be so much up and down, it'd be very difficult to actually tell what's happening with the chart. But right now we could actually deduce by just looking at this that although we are talking 2C at the most of difference between the temperatures, that speed 3 and speed 2 actually look to be the most beneficial in terms of the lowest overall temperatures. Now there's a theory as to why that might be. The D5 is known to actually dump a lot of heat at full speed. That motor that's on the back of the D5, I mean, it's a big cylindrical motor, that motor is cooled by the coolant. Now, it's probably not fair to say that that D5 could actually dump enough heat into the loop that it would be noticeable when compared to the heat going into the 5090. But I know back in the old days, though, there was all this adage of run your D5, because they're all made by Lang, they're all kind of a Lang rebrand. Run your Lang D5 pump at a lower speed, otherwise you're gonna dump a ton of heat into your loop. So I've never actually found a way to be able to measure that. I guess I'd have to use some sort of a thermal camera on the back of it at max speeds to see how hot the back of the pump is getting, the housing. It's matte black, so the measurement on that would actually be very easy to measure because it's matte black. But anyway, there's a theory that it could be dumping less heat into the loop. 2C worth of 360 millimeters and the amount of volume that's in here, which is over a liter of volume, is probably very unlikely to be the pump having the reason behind the couple of degrees difference. Let's talk about frequencies though, because temperature is only half the story. Your temperature leads to your overall frequencies. Now, frequencies are determined by the temperature because you have obviously the thermal curve. So there's a thermal curve that says, if your GPU is within this power and this temperature range, this is what your speed will be. And as the temperature goes up, the speed comes down, and that's one of the ways that it keeps itself from just kind of running away and getting super hot. So once again, if we look at a full zoomed out chart of starting at 0, going all the way up to 300 or 3000 megahertz, you can see they're very, very difficult to tell. They all kind of stand on top of each other, but there is actually a little bit of a spread between the maximum and lowest average frequency when it comes to the GPU. So once again, if we zoom in, you can see all of them start a little higher, and then over time they start to drop down a little bit. That's because, again, as the temperature goes up, the boost bins come down slightly. But if you look at this right now, the bright green line giving us our highest actual spikes in frequency. Now, those spikes is every time the Steel Nomad test kind of starts over. So that's why there's these spikes. The reason why you're seeing the bright green line is because of the fact that, one, it's layered on top of the pink line, which is actually speed 2. But 2, you can see it actually kind of matches speed 2 here. So although we got speed 5 giving us some of those highest spikes, we can also argue that speed 2 at 1.2 liters per minute is giving us that same frequency. So that would actually deduce that at the end of the day, there's no real reason to run speed 5 on your pump, because speed 2, or potentially even speed 3, although you can't really see it on here, because again, they overlay on top of each other almost so perfectly, is showing you that there's no reason to run your pump at 100%. Now, why would you want to run your pump at 100%? It really comes back to, once again, the resistance in your loop. If you have a very restrictive loop, like ways I can make this loop more restrictive, if I was to add, say, another radiator. Let's say I added a 140 mil or a 120 mil radiator in the back. That's another major turns that the fluid has to take. That's more fins and rows that the fluid has to make its way through, which are crazy turns every time. That would add more resistance. And realistically, even at speed 1, I was really surprised that the temperatures didn't really show the difference in flow rate. That's what surprised me most. I expected speed 5 to not be so far out in the lead or in the lead at all to basically negate the reason for ever running your pump at 100%. But I kind of expected speed 1 to be terrible. Now, if you look at the frequency chart, you can see speed 1, which is the light blue line, does tend to kind of be towards the bottom. Now, you can also say there's some yellow down there as well, which is speed 3. So what I'm getting at right here is the fact that I did not see any sort of thermal runaway, or because the fluid was moving so slowly, it didn't seem like that it wasn't doing enough work to actually be able to move the heat away from the component. If you're not familiar at all about how a water cooling loop works, liquid, specifically water, or in this instance, a propylene glycol-based coolant, has a higher thermal capacity than air. That means it can hold more heat before it becomes saturated. So the idea is that you are having fluid constantly running over the component, and as it touches the hot part, it picks up that heat and carries it away with it. It carries that heat away to the radiators, where the fans pull air through the radiators, and then that heat is transferred back from liquid through those cooling fins to the air, and then taken away into your room. That's why your room gets hot when you game, because those heat sinks for air coolers do the very same thing. Now, the theory would be if it was moving so slowly that it actually wouldn't be able to carry the heat away fast enough. Now, obviously, this shows if you have any sort of movement over it whatsoever, it's going to do the job. Now, the other theory could be because the coolant's moving so slowly, it's also spending more time in the radiator, which is getting the overall coolant to come down more before it comes out of the coldest part in the loop, which is going to be the second radiator, because I do go from rad to rad. So as it comes out of that second radiator, the coolant's going to be at its coolest point in the loop, which means it's going to be overall colder as it touches the GPU. So realistically, your pump speed is not important when it comes to your cooling loop. And that's something I've always said. Now, I guess you could argue I went on the hunt for the perfect scenario that would sort of prove that point, but this is physics. Physics doesn't care about my opinion. Physics doesn't care about your opinion. Physics are what they are. Now, I'm a bit surprised because I really thought speed won because you can't even see the coolant moving in the reservoir. Like speed 3, 4, and 5, at that setting, you see like turbulence happening in the reservoir. You can see the amount of fluid coming back out of the tube, shooting straight into the reservoir, which is literally hitting a wall and then has to come straight down. Again, more of that resistance stuff I was talking about. It hits that wall so hard, it creates kind of a fan effect and you can see the turbulence happening in the reservoir. But at speed 1, you don't see that happening at all. It is perfectly still. So that really had me think that the flow rate was so low that I might have expected to see the temperature get too high. But at the end of the day, the boost bins that we're talking about difference here is at most 30 megahertz. Now, if you have a GPU that's running well over 2750 megahertz, are you gonna notice 30? No, you're not. You see it on a chart, but you were never gonna notice it in an actual gaming scenario at all, period, end of story. It's kind of like the butt dyno effect in a car. You can't trust it because sometimes you have a confirmation bias where you're like, well, I did something, I put in a new air filter, it should be faster. Oh yeah, I feel it, it's so much faster. But then you dyno the thing and it's like 3 horsepower difference and there's no way you're gonna feel 3 horsepower unless we're talking about a 10 horsepower car. I digress. Instead of going back to cars, which I tend to always use as analogies, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. The only time it becomes a problem is if your pump speed is so slow, it has a hard time starting the flow through the loop. Now that can happen. I've had pumps that are PWM that are set so low that the pump doesn't actually start very easily. And so the pump will start to do this kind of a current protection thing where instead of the pump knows if the impeller is turning because it can feel the resistance of the magnet. If it doesn't start turning, then what it will do is it will save itself, stop, turn off, try and turn back on, turn off, turn back on. You can actually hear kind of a click happening and sometimes you can see the fluid kind of move for a second. So sometimes pumps, especially manual pumps, you don't want to set them too low because then they won't start. If it's a PWM type pump, just like a fan, it'll start at a higher RPM for starting voltage and then it will ramp back down. But that doesn't happen with manual pumps. So it is possible to have it set so low if your restriction is so high in your loop that the pump can't actually properly get started. That's about the only time the pump speed is gonna truly matter. So at the end of the day, what did I do with my system? By looking at these results here, I actually set my pump back to speed 3, and there's a reason for that. There becomes a point where there's resonance in a loop and in a system and anything spinning and anything that has a motor in it. Now those motors are not perfectly balanced, just like your wheels and tires on your car. You gotta go and put, here we go back to the car analogies again, but you have to put weights on your wheels to offset any of the imperfect balances that happens with wheels and tires. You can't do that with your pump. As it's spinning at certain RPMs, you can find resonance frequencies. Well, it will start to vibrate and make sort of a hum sound, even if you can't feel it in your desk, which sometimes you can. Skunkworks has 2 pumps, so I could feel the vibrations in the desk if the pumps were set at a weird resonance, and they could harmonize with each other sometimes and cause problems if they're set at frequencies that kind of counteract each other, which can either balance itself out that way or make it twice as bad. But I picked a speed 3 on this particular system because that's where I could no longer hear the hum. It really came down to that point now. So that's the only reason why the pump speed would matter for this particular loop, is about tuning out resonance and vibration, because there's no anti-vibration in this particular setup. It can get transferred right through the system, right through the feet, right into the table, and right into your hands as you have your hands on the desk gaming. So anyway, there we go. I'm gonna kind of put this topic to rest. AIOs are a totally different story, mostly because of the fact that the volume of liquid and the pumps are so weak in AIOs that there definitely can become a point where at the lowest starting speed, which was about 40% on a lot of the AIOs when they're plugged into fan headers, is not enough to get the fluid moving, kind of like I said, which is where you see the temperatures really start to take off. Because you could even set an AIO pump to 0%. Technically, a lot of them will allow it, which is obviously bad because you need to have some fluid motion over the loop. In fact, what I could have done, but I can't do it because I can't set this one to 0, but I could have if it was PWM, is go into something like the BIOS, stop the pump entirely, show you how the temperature on the CPU will start to climb, because the coolant's just sitting there being superheated by the CPU. And if I were to barely crack the speed and just get any motion whatsoever, any flow at any rate, you'll see that temperature shoot straight down. So the physics are there, they don't lie. At the end of the day, I still see people arguing that you should be running your pumps like full speed and this and that. That only kills its lifespan. Now, 60,000 hours is what most of these motors are rated at, anywhere between 60,000 and some of them even to 100,000. You're even if you ran it full speed, that's where it's intended to last, is that speed setting. So when you see a rating for a motor, that's at its max speed. So at speed 5, you should get 60,000 plus hours out of that motor, which is obviously going to be plenty for anyone. So it really just comes down to the acoustics and the vibrations and the sounds of the pump. Slow it down so that you can get it to where it's tolerable, but it's not going to affect your cooling on an open loop like this. The other thing too is those ratings are also, it doesn't mean you're only going to get 60,000 hours, because the way those ratings work, let's say you have 100 of those being tested, the rating is where did 50% of them fail. So that means by the time that 60,000 hours happened, it means half those pumps that were tested have already failed, but half of them are still going. That's where it gets the rating. That's how all motors are rated, is at the 50% failure rate for the testing pool when they do the designs. But anyway, I'm gonna get out of here. I was really utilizing this system to do a lot of tests I've been needing and wanting to do, which I haven't had a chance to really this isn't a deep dive, this is more like I'd call it a shallow end dive, I guess. We're in the water, but we're not scuba diving here. We're more snorkel. It's like a snorkel dive, if you will. But if you guys got something else you want us to test around here to kind of do some myth busting or whatever, I'm really having a lot of fun with this sort of stuff. So sound off in the comments below what you think we should test, especially if it's water cooling loop related. Since we've got summer months coming up, I like to focus on water cooling content in the summer, because depending on the region you live in, sometimes you gotta, or you start to thermal throttle. It's crazy how summer heat really does impact gaming performance and such in your systems. All right, guys, sound off down below. As always, we'll see you in the next one.